Ever since the dawn of mankind, we've wondered what happens to us once we run out of extra lives. Is it simply game over, or is there a bonus level or spectator mode afterwards? Is there a part of us that persists even in death? Ghost stories have been around since ancient times. In some cases, the stories are meant to be comforting, the idea that our ancestors watch over us. On the flip side, ghosts have become synonymous with themes of horror. An angry, vengeful spirit who can stalk and sometimes even kill its victim if you're not careful. There's no shortage of ghost stories, and they exist in pretty much every culture that has ever been. Whether it's folklore, songs, books, TV shows, or movies, ghosts are here to stay. And the same thing goes for video games. The Zelda series is no exception. They've appeared as early as the very first installment and have continued to do so all the way up to its most recent titles. The idea of life after death is quite prevalent in Zelda, and similar to real life, it ranges from something positive like meeting the apparition of a deceased ally who helps you in some way, to negative experiences like evil spirits who serve as enemies or obstacles.
The games make it clear that the deceased can sometimes linger in this world and won't pass on to the afterlife until they have achieved some sort of goal, find peace, or are destroyed indefinitely, usually by force. In some cases, it can even be that the dead are unable to rest because of a curse, something that binds them to the world of the living, making them unable to move on until said curse is lifted. They come in all shapes and sizes, but the most famous rendition of ghosts in the series are of course the Poes. They are said to be spirits of the dead that became monsters because of an unresolved attachment to the mortal world, the most common of which are the feelings of regret, rage, and hatred. It's hard to pinpoint the exact rules surrounding these spirits, as they aren't universal and can sometimes differ slightly depending on the game they are featured in. For instance, in A Link to the Past and Ocarina of Time, they can manifest at any time, even in broad daylight, whereas in The Wind Waker and Twilight Princess, they only appear at night or in dark places the sun doesn't reach, like caves and dungeons. The Wind Waker especially explains that Poes hates sunlight, because it makes them vulnerable to physical attacks. Their abilities also differ slightly from game to game. In Ocarina of Time, they can turn invisible for small periods of time, during which attacking them is impossible. In The Wind Waker, they can temporarily possess a living host, rendering them confused and disoriented for a while. And in Twilight Princess, they are invisible at all times, and can only be seen and attacked by Wolf Link when using his special senses. We have seen many different designs over the course of the series, from hooded wraiths with glowing eyes, masked hoodlums, to imp-like puppets wielding a scythe, all with their own looks, personalities, and abilities. But there's one thing these menaces from the afterlife have in common, and that is that in a lot of cases they are seen carrying a lantern, sometimes a torch. There are exceptions here and there, but the lantern is definitely a design choice that has been carried over all across the series, even when the design of the creature itself is vastly different. It is also apparent that the lantern or torch is an actual physical object. For instance, in Ocarina of Time, when a Poe becomes invisible, the lantern is the only thing that remains visible, and upon defeating them, the lantern will fall to the ground and shatter, freeing the soul of the Poe, which can even be collected. This process also reveals their true form, a spectral flame burning in various colors, most commonly blue, orange, green, and purple. Although every game does its own thing and sets different goals and limits when it comes to the lore behind ghosts, there's definitely an overarching theme to be found. That being one of lanterns or flames whenever ghosts or spirits are involved.
But why is that? Is it just a random design choice, or is it based on something? Like religion, stories, or folklore, as Nintendo is often known to do. For instance, the famous ghost hand seen in Skyward Sword is derived from a Japanese ghost story. A story about a spirit named Hanako who may reach up from a toilet to snatch up an unsuspecting victim. Well, as you've probably guessed, yes, the flames and lantern are probably derived from real-life stories as well. The most likely candidate being an old legend which has been passed down for many centuries. The willow the wisp, or will in the wisp, is an atmospheric ghost phenomena first documented in the English language by William Fulk in 1563. Starting with the Latin ignis fatuus, meaning foolish fire, the term has seen many different translations, meanings, and interpretations. The stories involve mysterious, ghostly lights, often witnessed during nighttime by travelers. The most common description is that of a pale blue flame moving or dancing around in the distance. They were mostly seen in and around swamps and marshes, though some eyewitness reports also include forests and even graveyards. Although will-o'-the-wisp is the most well-known version nowadays, at least in Western culture, similar stories have existed all over the world, each with their own names, meanings, and stories attached to it. Japan, too, has its own share of similar stories like the onibi, hitodama, and kitsunebi, all of which describe a similar phenomena of flames, balls of fire, or mysterious lights floating around at night. Because there's so many similar legends and eyewitness accounts of this phenomena from different cultures, naturally people had different interpretations of what they could be, ranging from evil fairies to witches, elves, and of course, the souls of the dead. Their nature too is not universal, as some cultures viewed them as harmless or even good, while others saw them as malicious, evil, or dangerous. Because of this, it's hard to put a definitive stamp on what they are and what their purpose is. In a lot of Western folklore, they are said to be the spirits of the dead who attempt to lure people deeper into the marshes, after which they sink into the swamp and die, or become irreversibly lost, never to be seen again. The lights are seen as deceitful tricksters, and those who come across one should avoid giving into temptation and attempt to follow it. The Japanese onibi and hitodama are the closest thing to the will-o'-the-wisp, and even translated as such on some occasions. According to the folklore, onibi are spirits born from the corpses of humans and animals. They are also described as being resentful and having been transformed into fire. A famous encyclopedia compiled in 1712 describes them as a blue light, like a pine torchlight, and that humans who come too close would have their spirits sucked out of them. Similarly, the hitodama are said to be the spirits of the deceased who take on the shape of a flame. As with the wisps, they are deceitful and play tricks on the living, such as getting travelers lost. They commonly appear in watery areas like wetlands, but also forests, prairies, and graveyards. The similarities between the onibi/hitodama and the will-o'-the-wisp seems to suggest that whatever people saw back in the day, they are describing the same type of phenomena. As for their explanation, well, there have been many, from glowing fungi to fireflies, glowworms, and more. The lights observed inside marshes and swamps have often been attributed to gas rising up from the bogs. Mostly composed of methane, this gas is known to sometimes spontaneously combust, and methane also just so happens to burn a pale blue color. In the case of the graveyard lights, the element phosphorus, which is abundant in human remains such as teeth and bones, is used as an explanation. It too can apparently ignite during specific weather conditions, creating flames that linger for a while.
Funnily enough, ever since modern science has started finding rational explanations for the phenomena, sightings of the will-o'-the-wisp have become almost non-existent. It's not exactly clear why, though some suggest that this is because since the 1600s, a lot of marshland has disappeared due to human intervention, and graveyards that feature open bone pits are no longer a common practice either. Because of the dancing or swaying motions of the lights when observed from a distance, people often associated them with lanterns or torches, a flame moving around on its own as if being carried around by an invisible ghostly entity. It is also from where the most famous Halloween decoration, the jack-o'-lantern, got its inspiration from. These lights were seen all over the world and documented in books, used in stories and fairy tales, and of course inevitably made their way into fiction as well, especially in fantasy and horror. One famous example are the dead marshes featured in The Lord of the Rings, an ancient battlefield turned into a haunted marshland, where the corpses of the dead are still submerged in its many bogs and lakes. Similar to the stories of the Wisp, the dead inside the marsh will attempt to draw people in, joining them in death, which is why Gollum wisely says,
"Don't follow the lights."
Lastly, we have the Japanese paper lantern ghost, though in this case it's the lantern itself that has become a sentient being, rather than it being carried by a ghostly figure or representing its soul. It's based on the belief that inanimate objects can become alive when they reach an old age, and although it does involve a lantern, it's likely not the inspiration for the ghostly flames in the Zelda series, as the idea doesn't apply to lanterns alone, though it could have inspired other Zelda enemies or themes. Which brings us back to the games. It's clear to me that the Poes Poes, their lanterns, and the fiery soul they leave behind are based on the stories and legends of the willow the wisp and similar myths. The same goes for a lot of the other ghostly phenomena seen in the games. Whenever someone dies or crosses over to the underworld, their soul can sometimes linger, often taking the form of a flame, most commonly a pale blue or greenish flame. In this state, they cannot interact much with the world of light. A possible reason why the Poes carry their souls inside of a lantern is to protect or guard it from their enemies. Alternatively, it could be a way for them to manifest into a physical body capable of interacting with the world of the living. By housing their soul inside of a physical object, they gain a foothold in the physical plane. A great example of this, aside from the Poes, is the spirit of King Rome boss Varamas Hyrule. He too is seen carrying a lantern around whenever he takes on the form of the old man. But as soon as he reveals his true identity, the lantern disappears and he takes on the form of an apparition surrounded by flames. As such, it's likely that his soul is stored inside the lantern as a way to hide the fact that he's a spirit, as well as a way to gain a physical presence. Ghosts and spirits will likely always have their place in the series. Whether it's an apparition, a shadow, a spirit animal, a lingering flame, or a vengeful monster, it all depends on what role they once played and the emotional attachment they have to the world they inhabit. Poes are resentful, filled with hatred and rage, and thus they turned into a monstrous entity who seeks to do harm. The flames they carry are what binds them to the world of the living, their true essence. As soon as this essence is destroyed, they will either cease to exist in this world or end up in a glass jar, for sale at your local pharmacy. And that concludes the video. Happy Halloween, and to those celebrating this year, stay safe and have fun. A big thanks to Konrad for joining me in this one. You can check out his Halloween video by clicking the end card or the link in the description below. As always, many thanks to my mods on Discord and live streams, and to my generous Patreons and channel members. You guys are and always will be the best. And that is all for now. This is Dawn signing off, and have a good one.